Thank you very much. First, I want to say it's a pleasure to be here today, being invited by the Home Builders Association, and also it's been an honor to have been invited to participate as a co-chair of the city's Fire and Life Safety Group, Technical Working Group. I am a fire protection engineer by education and practicing with Wisjani Elsner Associates here in Chicago. I've been practicing here in the city for over 40 years. I know it doesn't look like it, but it's true. One of the things I want to talk about, and I understand that because a number of our clients had approached us in the last couple of years, Grant touched on this a little bit, but I want to get into it a little bit more detail about the State Fire Marshal was attempting to enforce its code, the NFPA Life Safety Code, in the city of Chicago. And the Chicago Building Code and the NFPA Life Safety Code are not the same in many cases, presented conflicts of trying to enforce one code versus the other. That has been resolved by a recent change in the Illinois state law through Illinois Public Act 101-0082, worked out between the State Fire Marshal's Office and the Chicago Department of Buildings and the Chicago Fire Department. Now the state has reached a resolution that the state code does not apply within the city limits of Chicago, except for state-owned buildings or state-licensed buildings like hospitals and daycare facilities. So that is all good news. And part of it is because the city has brought its codes in greater alignment through this code modernization process. So that was a step in that direction. A couple of things that affect small residential buildings. There are a number of differences between the IBC and the City of Chicago's new code, changes in some of the definitions. But a couple that particularly relate to small residential I've highlighted here. The fire separation distance is normally the distance between a building and a property line, or in the case of a public way, the distance between the building and the center line of a public way, like the street. The Chicago Code definition is a bit different. It measures that distance between the building and the opposite side of that public way or the opposite side of the street. So that distance becomes greater, taking advantage of the width of the full width of the street rather than just to the center line. So that tends to make the requirement for exterior wall ratings a little more liberal. And that reflects the density of the built environment in the city. One item that remains the familiar, if you are users of the IBC, we have IBC design folks here. Not too many? Okay. If you're familiar with the IBC, you know that the IBC has a 3-hour firewall. Chicago is maintaining its definition of a firewall being rated at 4 hours. And when there are openings, the double Class A doors on those openings. However, Chicago has relaxed the requirement so that it is the traditional IBC requirement, so that it does not need to be structurally independent on each side of the wall. So that's sort of a compromise between the two. And you've heard already about the new use group R5. I won't mention that again. But I do have the definition that I highlighted here on this next slide. This is the definition of R5, and there are a couple things again I want to highlight. An R5 is defined to be residential buildings that are no more than 4 stories above grade and have 1, 2, or 3 dwelling units. And there are no other occupancies associated with the building, no mixed use with the building. Also allowed having accessory buildings can be defined, provided they're not more than 2 stories. So that is the definition for an R5 in Chicago. as Grant mentioned, the IRC is not being used in Chicago. I want to talk a little bit about what I would say is a change in philosophy regarding fire safety with the new code. The IBC and its document, the IFC, the International Fire Code, about the last 30 years, since about the mid-'80s, has relied upon more what we call active fire suppression systems versus passive. Passive fire protection you can consider to be barriers like firewalls and rated floors and rated roofs. That serves to provide a compartmentation for fire spread. The IBC over the years has moved to active fire protection, such as sprinkler protection, fire detection systems, and annunciation systems. That has proven to provide a benefit in fire safety that has been measurable across the United States. And so that philosophy now you'll find in the Chicago Building Code. There will be more requirements for sprinklers in not just residential, but in the commercial building side as well. And generally speaking, the new Chicago Code will provide more liberal allowable areas for sprinkler protection and a little less liberal reliance on street frontage increase, which was kind of a passive thing as well. So that philosophy is showing in the new code. It will also, by doing this, it will also, the new code tends to, it doesn't tend to, the new code adopts some of the more modern NFPA standards regarding the design and installation of these active fire suppression systems. And with that, because of the recognition of more modern materials and installation methods, it will tend to lower installation costs for those systems as part of the mandate for them. It does give a more liberal cost implications. And in the effort, the Chicago Fire Department was a participant on our working committee, and we made sure that the current method of operation the fire department uses with respect to how they approach a building and what they expect to find in a building for fire sprinkler, water supplies, for example, fire alarm system notification of occupants, and standpipe system operations. These are the built-in piping systems for fire suppression, manual suppression. Those have all been harmonized in the new Chicago Building Code with what the fire department operations have been. Generally also, the electrical requirements associated with these fire protection systems, like fire pumps and fire alarm systems, they have been modified to reflect the practices that are in the national codes, generally somewhat relaxation and generally more cost effective. Similarly, the requirements in the code for carbon monoxide detection have been harmonized with the national standards, national requirements in the international codes, and there are few less requirements for carbon monoxide detection in the new Chicago Building Code. You will find in residential, you will find requirements for carbon monoxide detection in residential uses where there is fuel-fired equipment, like the national standards. Okay, one of the big things you've heard today from both of my colleagues here on the podium, starting in January of next year, no matter whether you use the old code or the new code, there'll be a requirement for automatic sprinkler protection in residential occupancies other than R5s, other than where there are 3 or fewer units, but anything more than 4 or more units, automatic sprinkler protection will be required. There are some relaxations and cost reductions to be to help this get in process here. The automatic sprinkler systems in Residential will not need to be monitored in the low-rise residential. They will not need to off-site monitoring. And also, there are ways to build low-rise residential without automatic sprinklers. It's been talked about in townhouses, for example. If 3 or fewer units are separated by the 4-hour firewalls, no sprinklers are required. Or in R2 occupancies, which are multifamily, less than or equal to 4 stories, with 2 or fewer units in a fire area, sprinklers would not be required if there are 2 means of egress using stairways within that fire area. Hold on, please, till the end.
Are we talking about 13D?
I'll get to that in a minute. How about that? This is a summary of the allowable height in stories based on construction type for residential use, R5s, the R5s, and not all residential. But this is a summary of the allowable number of stories based on whether the building has no sprinkler protection, whether it's using 13D, 13R, or 13. What are the differences? NFPA 13 is the standard for the design and installation of sprinkler systems, essentially in commercial buildings. High-rise residential, you'd be looking at an NFPA 13 system, or other commercial buildings is an NFPA 13 system. Those systems have been around for over 100 years, and they've got a really good track record of success. NFPA 13D, that second line item there in the table, is the standard for the design and installation of sprinklers in 1 and 2 family dwellings. When that standard was written in the 1980s, it was intended to provide strictly for the life safety of the occupants, not property protection. And it has somewhat of a less robust of a water supply system, and sprinklers are allowed to be omitted in certain areas of the building, like attics. So again, it's not at the same league as a 13 system, and so there are less allowances for that when you read the IBC and also in the Chicago Building Code. And NFPA 13R is for the design and installation of sprinkler systems in multifamily residential buildings up to 4 stories and 60 feet. So that's kind of a compromise between 13 and 13D. It's for larger residential, but again, it's primarily interested in providing for the life safety of the occupants, does not have quite the robust water supply, and does allow sprinklers to be omitted, for example, in attic spaces, combustible attic spaces. So again, not quite as robust, but better than not having a sprinkler building. So the Chicago Building Code will allow the use of NFPA 13D systems in R5, not even when they're not required. One other major change, the IBC in general is a lot more clearer than what you might be used to with the old Chicago Building Code, and many of its requirements, including where smoke detection is required. Now, what I've got up on this slide is for the R5 uses, small residential. What we call smoke alarms are the fully integrated unit that detects the smoke and provides the sound, the audible notification to the occupant in that space. These are not interconnected systems or not interconnected detectors that are monitored by a control panel or off-site. These are individual detectors. And they are required to be in each sleeping room, outside of the sleeping rooms, within 15 feet of those sleeping rooms, in each story of a dwelling unit, and at the top of each interior exit stairway. And these are called, sometimes referred to, they used to be referred to as single station smoke alarms, smoke detectors. Now we call them smoke alarms. They are required in the code to be AC powered. You will find them typically with a battery backup, but the code will require new installations to be AC powered. There's also a third wire on these detectors so that they can be interconnected, such that if one detector is activated, it activates all the detectors that are interconnected. And it's allowed to be integral with a carbon monoxide detector, which will also be required. And that is the end of our presentation.